All right, guys. We'll give it a couple minutes. There's still some people joining, but appreciate you guys tuning in per usual. Just like clockwork. Share screen. Okay. Go. Good afternoon. For those of you joining, we'll give it a couple minutes. I realize this one was rescheduled, so I know there's some people joining late and that won't be able to make it, but this will be recorded and distributed with the registration list. And per usual, feel free to put things in the Q&A section. We will try to address as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation today. All right, well, we'll jump into it. I want to be cognizant of everyone's time, and we do have quite a bit to cover because I feel like there's been a lot of activity over the last month, and people might have additional questions that they want to ask since the last time we were able to host this call. First, I apologize for having to reschedule last week. I appreciate all the kind notes for all of you who wish me well to feel better, but I'm excited to jump back into this today and get going with the regular scheduled programming here. I am just trying to find, there we go. Okay. We'll jump right into it. March 2026, here we are. I'll give a brief overview of CABA and who we are today and what we're representing and working on. But I'm really going to focus a majority of today on the regulatory landscape at the federal level, and then we'll touch on how some of the state legislation is impacting the federal landscape as well. Some progress, some not so much. And then we'll also talk a little bit about the hemp beverage strategy, kind of what we're looking to implement, and then the general market overview. We'll also touch on some events for Q2 because somehow it is the end of March already. But if there are any questions, I'll address as many as I can by the end of the presentation. And again, feel free to ask about just about anything because I think there's a lot that's happened over the last month and a lot of things that people have questions on. I've certainly heard my fair share of rumors, so happy to try and educate and update on anything I have access to. So first, that we did have a few people who are new that registered for this call. The Coalition for Adult Beverage Alternatives is a federal coalition that was created a little over a year and a half ago now to focus specifically on the federal landscape and to prevent, unfortunately, what happened back in November and continue work towards legislation for the lower dose THC beverage category. Our primary principles, if you will, are there on the bottom right, are recommended regulations. So, nothing out of the ordinary here, very similar to other adult beverage, 21 plus, traditional retail and distribution models. You'll hear a lot about the 3-tier system or the alcohol regulatory framework that we're focusing on as a pathway forward, whether it's at the state or federal level. We're also, obviously we want to keep these hands out of these products out of the hands of minors. That's nothing new. I don't think there's a single good actor out there that wants these products in the hands of kids. But we also focus on no health claims, third party testing, access to the testing. And we might be one of the only groups on the Hill asking for taxation. As we all have discussed before, taxation really adds a level of legitimacy, but it also evens the playing field in a really big way for some of our alcohol partners. It's also why we've really been focused on advocating for the three-tier system. Not only is it a system that has already been proven effective for the adult beverage category, but it puts our products on the shelves where we've always wanted them to be, which is alongside their alcohol counterparts. It's also been very effective at keeping counterfeit product out of the marketplace. And I think ultimately, when you look at the hemp industry and what legislators are concerned about, it's a lot of product that's copycat. It's marketed to kids. It's not really transparent where it's manufactured or what's in it. And I think ultimately that creates a lot of concern and that urgency you see for people to, shut this down, even though that there's an opportunity to create a safe and sustainable marketplace, particularly for low dose beverage, but also for additional products as well in the hemp, or I should say THC industry. So first I wanted to just talk about the setback back in November, because that's the level set. That's where we're at right now. And the current landscape really hasn't changed. So I think it's important for everyone to understand kind of where we sit today. So as of right now, there was a government shutdown, the funding bill passed, and it included that 0.4 milligrams of THC per container. Anything higher than that is therefore qualifies as marijuana and therefore is under the Controlled Substances Act. There were no carve-outs for any categories, and then there was a 1-year implementation period, which is why you keep hearing that November 12th deadline. Many states have Controlled Substances Act triggers, which means that the state automatically reverts back to the regulation that's implemented at the federal level. So that can supersede a number of the state programs, but I think a lot of retailers might not have been aware that their state might actually be one of those that qualifies under that CSA trigger. We need time. And the number one thing that you've probably heard about over the last few months is us asking for an extension. We need time to get the regulation right. And we know that the only way to do that is to provide the solution and work with regulators and legislators so that we can address their concerns, but also create a pathway forward. It's also important to recognize that if there had not been a government shutdown, we probably wouldn't be in the place that we are in today, where this got bundled into a basically it had to pass bill. They had to reopen the government. Thanksgiving was around the corner. Ironically, I'm going to say that they were worried about TSA and travel delays, and consumers don't like to see that, particularly around the holidays. And here we are with a lot of headaches, I think, at TSA across the country. It's very important that we understand that the vote to reopen the government was not necessarily a vote against hemp, but hemp was bundled into that. So there's definitely bipartisan support still for the hemp industry, and there is opportunity for us to work within the parameters and the opportunities that have been put forth by the federal government. But we have to listen to the feedback we're getting and interpret that into solutions that we can offer. Okay, there we go. So what's happened since last November? There's been a number of things. First of all, there was the White House had their executive order right before Christmas, which kind of acknowledged that the 0.4 milligram THC per container definition was too restrictive, even for the therapeutic and supplement products that President Trump wants to see go through the Medicare system. What's important to understand is that that initiative does not necessarily include intoxicating products. So the goal with that program is not to allow for intoxicating products. So our job is to create a pathway forward for those lower dose THC products that are derived from hemp so that we can continue to grow and expand our industry, but also clean up the existing marketplace, because this industry has just grown so much so fast that it does need guardrails put in place that address the concerns of legislators. You've seen a number of things introduced that could provide a little bit more runway for our industry. There were a number of extension attempts. One was a 2-year extension attempt, and then another was a 1-year that was ideally to go through the Farm Bill amendment. Those have really we have not seen the progress that we've wanted to. I will say the 2-year extension that was introduced by Baird in Indiana did get a lot of support and a lot of bipartisan support. If you look at the list of people who got behind that, I think you'd see that a lot of them don't agree on much, but this is an issue where we really do have an opportunity to prove that we are a bipartisan issue and that there's a number of reasons why we can get support for that, whether it's from the farmers or because of the states that currently have regulation in place and they don't want to see those infrastructures go away. The other obviously from the executive order, there was a lot of priority and emphasis on the CMS program. So that was, again, the goal to implement a reimbursable program through Medicare and Medicaid for, senior citizens to be able to get products that are considered therapeutic. They put the milligram dosage, which was announced last week, at 3 milligrams of THC per serving, which would be the requirement or the cap for these products. What's important to understand is that that is a program. And that is the dosage they've included in that program, but that does not change policy or law. So there has to be a policy change in order for that program to continue to proceed beyond November 12th, which creates urgency for Congress to do something before that November 12th deadline, whether that is some form of extension or putting forth some form of redefinition or regulation. There's a lot of questions about what the pathway forward is. But one thing that I think is very clear and we need to make sure everyone is aware of, there is no appetite for just a clean extension where the marketplace isn't cleaned up. What they hear is, okay, hemp is trying to kick the can down the road and they just want to be able to sell these, 100% synthetic or highly potent products to kids for the next 2.5 years. So that's why they're looking for an extension. So what we need to do is prove that we are okay with guardrails and restrictions, and we are willing to make compromise, and we are dedicated to seeing regulation go through, but that we need time. And I think that's ultimately the hardest part about it is even a perfect bill takes more than a year to get through, particularly during an election. Election years are very difficult to, get legislation through, particularly something that can be a polarizing issue on the Hill. So we are looking obviously for change and opportunities to make a correction. And the faster the better, but legislation ultimately does take time. So one thing that I do think is important, I already touched on the 3 milligram cap that CMS introduced last week. We've talked about this quite a bit, that could potentially create an opportunity for us to create a pathway for low dose products, whether that's at 3 milligrams or 5, that would obviously be TBD, but where that policy change would need to take place is also still a question. There will be opportunities for us to advocate for change or advocate for legislation maybe to be tacked on additional bills. But at this time, right now, we are focused on supporting the Griffith bill as well as the extension requests as they currently exist. That said, if we see additional legislation that we feel can really move the needle for our industry or a bill that, has an opportunity for additional changes to be made to, we will focus on those. I think I've said this before on previous calls. We're not single-threaded on approach. There's going to be a lot of it's not one strategy, it's multiple strategies. And depending on movement and on the Hill at the federal level, as well as some state activity, that really dictates how we decide to proceed with next steps. There are a lot of things that go on behind the scenes that cannot necessarily be publicly discussed, but it doesn't mean that we can't give you some high-level overviews of what we anticipate and what we expect to see in the marketplace. And I think it's important that we're all prepared for this to be an issue that gets tackled at the end of the year, right before, right after the election. So the election here is November 3rd. The ban would technically, as it currently exists, go into place November 12th. So by November 13th, where do these products go? Where do they sit? Has there been an offloading? Are there state programs that have been adjusted to accommodate for this? What are the opportunities? But I do think a lot of us need to be prepared for this to be something that gets handled or adjusted at the very end of the year or in an end of year funding package that is beyond the deadline. So that is something we need to be very aware of. Standalone legislation, as I mentioned, it evens the playing field if there is something that's introduced that really does promote three-tier system taxation, tied law practices that the alcohol industry would like to see. But that legislation generally takes over a year to get through. So it's one thing to introduce it this year or introduce legislation that we'd like to see, but the likelihood of it getting through before November 12th is slim to none just because of the current landscape that we're in. So setting some expectations. So we have to set a foundation, and getting something is a win. We need to get out of the existential threat territory, whether that is through some form of extension or, an opportunity that's created through a redefinition of that 0.4. One thing I always like to point out for people who are not necessarily from the alcohol industry is the fact that when we got out of prohibition for alcohol, 3-2 beer is where they started. You didn't have super high potency ABV products that were on the shelves. They started with 3-2 beer. And I know some states still have 3-2 beer, and there's some frustrations about where certain products can be sold, channels to market, whether it's convenience, grocery, or liquor. But it's important to know that you have to start somewhere and that other industries have done that. And the reason that the alcohol industry 100 years later has the legitimacy and the influence that it has is not only because of the amount of tax revenue and, congressional giving that they've brought over the years, but it's also because they proved that they were willing to work within a regulatory framework and improve upon that regulatory framework over time. So if we need to start between 3 and 5 milligrams per serving, and that is a federal dosage cap, that is something we will work with because something is better than nothing. And it's important that we consider that. It does not mean we will not advocate for other components to regulation that we've seen at the state level. I don't think there's any interest at the federal level to really supersede or eliminate state programs that have already been created. We have states like Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama. Obviously, we have states like Georgia and Florida that have gone through their regulations a little bit differently, not necessarily through ABC, but we have programs that are working. And they are seeing in some states tax revenue that they don't want to see. Obviously, we know Minnesota, but it is really important that we understand that DC does not look at this industry the same way a Minnesota looks at this industry. Obviously, this image, I think everyone knows the reference, but we're not in Minnesota anymore. DC, the audience is different. Their familiarity with THC as an ingredient is different. THC beverage, we've gotten away from having to answer the question, what is a THC beverage? So progress has been made over the last couple of years, but getting them comfortable with it as an intoxicant and products that could be bought through mainstream traditional retail, even if it is 21 plus to purchase, is still a hurdle that we have to climb and continue to work towards. The other reason that 5 milligrams is kind of a safe number that's been floated out there, and is probably the highest we would see if there is a federal dosage cap put into place, is because of some of the data and the state activity we've already seen. So the National Institute for Health declared that 5 milligrams for them is 5 milligrams for them is kind of what they define as a standard dose. We've also seen a lot of states define the serving size at 5 milligrams. We've seen some serving sizes be higher. We've seen some that are lower, but 5 seems to be a really approachable number. And the more data we can put behind 5 milligrams being a standard dose, the better. I think it also reduces opposition that we see from not only the alcohol industry, but also the marijuana industry, because those products, particularly for beverage, never performed well within the dispensary channel. I also think we need to be aware that form factors play a role here at the federal level. Obviously, we advocate for the low-dose THC beverage category, and our goal is to get beverage through. But there are other categories that can be safely regulated and distributed through similar channels to alcohol, or that THC beverage looks to leverage, right? But the reality is it is very difficult to sell the same audience in DC that's not that comfortable with THC with certain form factors. But there's also the marijuana industry, which sees some of these other form factors as competition, right? Candidly, THC flower isn't something that you are going to see a lot of appetite for at the federal level. Particularly, you're not going to see any support from the marijuana industry on THC flower because it's a direct competitor to those programs that exist in a number of states across the US. So we have to be realistic about what is likely to be palatable and plausible at the federal level. We did get a lot of questions more recently about whether state hemp programs can survive post November 12th. And the reality is, yes, but it's complicated. It makes me think of the Facebook stat, like relationship update. Like it's complicated. And it's not just complicated from a logistics manufacturing standpoint. There are complications with banking. And are you going to be able to use your credit card? So like if there's a bill where you can put a marijuana product through a traditional retail channel, are they going to have to collect cash? Are they going to be able to use credit cards? The supply chain, the product, would need to be, or the material might need to be grown within the state and then processed within the state. There just are a lot of challenges. Doesn't mean it can't be done, but there are a lot of challenges, and it will probably take a state like a Texas that generally doesn't like to be told what to do to really become aggressive about maintaining the program they're currently implementing, which I know there's been a lot of debate over the Texas legislation, but the reason we got that veto last year was because they understood that putting forth ban and prohibition type regulation was only going to support an illicit market, and a market that the cartel particularly plays into in in that state. So they want regulation because they want to clean up the marketplace. And in Texas, you've got a $6 billion industry, according to Senator Perry and the Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. So when you start putting regulation in place to clean up the market, you really don't want to see that go away, particularly if consumer safety is your primary reason. So beverage, we have a lot of support in beverage. And the reason that we have a lot of support in beverage is because one major reason, people are very familiar with intoxicants being consumed through beverages. It's completely normalized, particularly normalized in DC. Adult beverage is a social lubricant. A lot of people here, a lot of networking is done over drinks, but that's across the United States. That's across the whole world. People are very familiar with adult beverage. So when you introduce a form factor that blends in very nicely, that can utilize the same regulatory structure, that can leverage similar taxation models and compliance strategies, all of that is heavily influential and helpful for people to say, okay, like I can wrap my head around this. We also don't have to build a regulatory framework from scratch. We all know, particularly if we've operated on the cannabis side, creating a new infrastructure, a new regulatory body, all of that stuff takes time, and you generally have to work out the kinks. And we're certainly going to have to work out the kinks if we start working, within the three-tier system. I don't think anyone's going to argue that it's a perfect system, but it is a system that exists, has cleaned up the marketplace and kept counterfeit product out of the alcohol channels. And it's something that's been very effective for tax revenue at the federal and, of course, at the state level, we see tax revenue as well. So the infrastructure works. And us being able to utilize that to create a pathway forward is something that I think really, really resonates. It also shows that because we're advocating for a very strict regulatory policy, that we are differentiating ourselves from some of the bad actors out there that really want kind of a free and open market. I think we all know that right now, the hemp versus marijuana conversation is temporary. THC is THC. But at the end of the day, we need to work within the parameters we're given to create a pathway forward. And right now, regulation over hemp and differentiating between the non-intoxicating products and the intoxicating products and what pathways to market make sense based on dosage is going to be critical. But we have to find a place to start somewhere, and focus on regulation versus prohibition, and regulation that we might not all love, but it might get us a foot in the door to improve upon over time. The other thing that really helps the beverage category in particular are who our partners are. So I think everyone's familiar with the Wine and Spirits Wholesalers of America. They've been our loudest advocate federally for the last couple of years. Recently, the National Association of Convenience Stores has gotten heavily involved. If you were at their NAC show in the last October, you know that THC Beverage came up pretty much in every general session and was a big priority for them to figure out how they can support this industry. And they are really looking to lean into it going into this second half of the year here. The two newer groups that have been recently created at the beginning of this year are the Beverage Alcohol Merchants Coalition. So that was created by Total Wine, Specs, ABC Florida, Bevmo, and I know a number of other retailers are looking to get engaged there. But ultimately, they wanted to make sure that the liquor retailers are being heard at the federal level, and that they are really leaning into showing why they need to keep this industry alive, which, as we all know, with alcohol being on the decline, this is something that's making up for that loss across the United States. The other group that I'll mention is the Beverage Wholesalers for Responsible Regulation. This is mainly created by a number of the beer wholesalers who wanted to make sure that their voice was being heard at the federal level as well, because as we all know, over 50% of the beer wholesalers in the US, if not much higher, are actively involved in this space, as well as the beer, craft beer manufacturers and co-packers who have actively entered this space and are supplying all of our supply chain needs. So these groups collectively, when we walk in and lobby together, are much stronger because that's a collective. Here are the three tiers: the suppliers, the wholesalers, and the retailers coming in together with one unified ask, one solution, and willing to work together to compromise to get something through. But getting something through before the end of next year or the end of this year is definitely going to be difficult. So I wanted to make sure everyone has this kind of visual in mind. When it comes to the federal landscape, we know right now the farmers needed to plant basically yesterday. We do know that some farmers did in fact plant hemp with the idea that there is an adjustment made and they will be selling these products. Now they are very much, from what my understanding, the farmers do have an opportunity through the CMS program to be supplying, things like minor cannabinoids and CBD through that program. So as a result, there is certainly opportunity for them to offload their harvest in the fall if the CMS program is kept alive. But again, we need that policy change to support that program. State sessions typically run, January through June. There are some that run longer. There are some that aren't running at all this year, kind of like Texas, which runs every 2 years. But typically there's a lot of state activity right now. We're going to touch on some of the state activity shortly here in a few slides. But there's a lot of activity now, and what happens at the state level and what we're able to achieve can really help what we want, what we're able to get across, and how we're able to influence at the federal level as well. But I think what everyone's probably paying attention to is that election deadline, which is November 3rd, and the fact that July through October, there's a little bit of a chilling effect if we are not able to adjust the deadline. Now, if we're able to get some momentum that gives some positive indicators, it's very possible that the chilling effect is minimized to a degree, but what that looks like, the exact timeline, is again still very much to be determined. So it's important that we all keep this timeline in mind, because there's a reason that there's so much urgency, particularly for fundraising right now. And I will be the first to tell you guys, whether you join CABA or you join, the Hemp Roundtable or the Hemp Beverage Alliance, these groups all have very specific goals that they are looking to achieve. And this audience that registers for these calls, that looks for their updates, are primarily beverage folks, but there are some that are in gummies and in other form factors as well. So I'm not going to stand here and always say, like, please join CABA, please, donate to our cause. The beverage folks are all working together. However, there is urgency to bring in dollars now. It is extremely difficult to plan and execute a strategy with just the monthly dues as they currently come in. Lobbyists are very expensive, and a number of groups have multiple lobbyists at the federal level. And I can tell you, Beverage in particular has over 20 lobbyists working on this issue from top firms, working on this issue around the clock, which is amazing. But it's also very expensive, which is why it's so important that we continue to encourage others to donate and bring funds together, whether it's through WSWA, BAMCO, CABA, the beer wholesalers or beverage wholesalers for responsible regulation, or other associations, that donations come in. And it's not just going to be your regular dues amounts. Our dues amounts range from $100 a month through to $5,000 a month based on your revenue for hemp-derived beverages and supply chain efforts for hemp-derived beverages. But we are looking for large bulk donations that help us fund really large initiatives in the short term to lead to a long-term goal. Polling, for example, you could be paying 6 figures for a national poll. You could be paying 5 figures for a regional poll. But the idea and what I'm trying to drive across is that none of this is done cheaply, and you don't get to pay over time. We don't get to say, hey, we need a poll now, but we're going to pay you for the next 2 years on monthly installments. This isn't how this works here. You pay up front, you get what you put into it. There's no guarantee, but I can tell you the one guarantee that there is that if we don't spend the money on supporting this industry and trying to keep it alive now, we will absolutely have a ban that goes into place November 12th. We need to bring resources forward now. Again, it can be through my association, other associations, other groups, but it is important that you find a group that represents what you are looking to support, and you ask them how they're looking to implement and utilize those funds, what their strategy is, make sure they're aligned, and then get involved. Now, it is important that everyone knows that getting involved does not mean that you will be involved in the day-to-day. Some groups obviously are because they've hired independent lobbyists and they're working with multiple different groups. So they might be involved in some of the day-to-day advocacy things. But I think most people on this call, from looking at the list that RSVP'd and registered, most of you have businesses to run. So it's important that you find a group that you trust so that when you give them those dollars, you know it's going towards initiatives that you care about that support your business initiatives. And that is ultimately our goal. I will tell you there's been a lot of activity on the Hill, and it's important to talk about that. There's been a lot of fundraiser receptions for various groups. We don't go into detail on those on public calls. CABA does have a private policy strategy call where we give updates on specific meetings and things like that. But a lot of that needs to be kind of kept close to the chest as we continue to work on various strategies. There are hill climbs. Hemp Beverage Alliance and U.S. Hemp Roundtable just had their hill climbs this week and had numerous meetings with various groups on the Hill. Regulatory agencies are constantly being met with for educational purposes and also to try to influence how some of the regulations with, CMS or other programs might be implemented in the future, whether that's short-term or long-term. We are trying to build a foundation that allows us to have long-term relationships. That is a big part of these federal strategies. This is not a short-term game. We are in this for the long haul. Post November 12th, ban or not, there's going to be work to do. Even if we win by November 12th, we're going to have more work to do. There's a reason that WSWA still exists and NAC still exists, because there's never not something to fight for or protect your industry from. So this is the long game. We are playing the long game, but we have to set a really strong foundation now. And there's multiple meetings constantly happening with different members of Congress. Again, constantly trying to identify champions and make sure that they are aware of who our target demos are and the initiatives and how this impacts our businesses. Which brings me to making DC care. Grassroots plays a very large part in this. Yes, there's various ways that we can influence through other channels, but it is important that consumers as well as retailers and state associations understand the risks in place. So maintaining momentum and making sure that there's awareness that there is a potential ban in place is critical. So the Contact Your Congressman initiative is still very important for us to drive home. If you are a retailer or a brand that is sold in multiple retailers, having assets that bring awareness to this so the consumer knows that their favorite products could go away, that could be very impactful. A countdown on the website. The image here on the upper right here from WSWA, this is from their new microsite that they launched earlier this week. It has a ticker that shows this is when this goes away. That can be incredibly impactful, whether at retail or on your website, to bring awareness to this issue and hopefully drive some urgency and a call to action. Brand microsite, I highlighted cans here. CAN has Don't Ban CAN. There is a direct call to action on that website where you can submit your information and your feedback and contact your congressman through their landing page. On the right-hand side here where it says tell your elected officials to support the hemp industry, that is the action center on the Hemp Beverage Alliance site. So please leverage that if you want your voice to be heard. Doing that repeatedly is encouraged, but also particularly in states where you have current regulation that's being introduced and could potentially make traction that impacts our efforts at the federal level. Speaking of that, state activity. I consider this the regulatory pendulum because we always have to worry about the states as well as the federal. It's this is the new chicken or the egg, because if we keep this alive at the federal level, we have to get the state regulations right. If we don't keep it alive at the federal level, a lot of the state regulations don't matter as much, which is why we're seeing some bills either fail or stall. So Ohio and New York, for example, we've seen, movement efforts there stalling out, particularly because of some of which because of the November ban date. Kentucky, we've seen an on-premise bill moving forward. And I have to give credit to Cornbread Hemp that has really been spearheading a lot of that, but that bill is moving forward. So Kentucky continues to be a state that, building and making progress over time. They've had an infrastructure that's very similar to the alcohol regulatory framework, has taxation, has dosage caps, and ABC oversees it. And now on premise looks like it could be potentially coming back, which would be just, again, showing that we can work within an existing infrastructure and build to improve upon it over time. And when I say that, it's not just to show that we can accomplish that at the state level. It's so people understand that when we say we have to get our foot in the door and we have to start somewhere, that's not just a line. We're watching it happen in Kentucky. So patience is critical here. And I know that that's hard to say when we're facing an existential threat, but patience is key, and getting our foot in the door is the first step to this industry really blowing up, because then going backwards is really, really difficult, which we are kind of seeing now. Indiana and Illinois, particularly Chicago, looks like that's remaining status quo for now. Texas, we're hearing an injunction is likely, but there's a lot of work being done, a lot of meetings being done to do education on the industry itself. I mean, this has been an ongoing battle for the last couple of years. Anyone who's lived it probably has a lot of gray hair because of Texas, but ultimately, they want to get the regulation right, and we'll continue working with them to influence better standards and things that make it easier for the brands and the retailers to operate, as well as scale. South Carolina. So there's an ingestible bill. There might be some heavy compromise there. If you've been watching South Carolina and what's currently going on there, the bill that's been reintroduced puts all products. There are varying dosage caps, so up to 10 milligrams per serving in liquor. They are allowing, I believe, 170 milligrams per package for multi-servings, so essentially 17 servings of 10 milligrams in a 750 milliliter bottle. And then at the convenience and grocery and beer wine license level, they are allowing up to 5 milligrams per serving. The hardest part about this is for both retail channels, they are asking for behind the counter, which I think anyone who's come from the cannabis industry and has worked in the dispensary channel where that regulation was put in place. I know at one point Tennessee had that regulation, and it made it incredibly difficult for the consumer to get access to the product, makes it a little bit unapproachable, and it does impact sales. And of course, if you're familiar with C-stores, there's not a lot of room behind the counter to begin with. And a lot of that is for ZYNs and tobacco and nicotine package, things like that. And oftentimes, even liquor stores aren't necessarily equipped to have room behind the counter. So behind the counter, to put yourselves in the shoes of a regulator, when they hear behind the counter, they oftentimes think that prevents a 15-year-old, an 18-year-old from grabbing a product and walking out with it. It isn't necessarily always thought, wait, how does that logistically work within the retail location? So it's important that our state chapters, our associations, our various groups are vocal and very involved in these conversations, so that we can point out when there's a logistics hurdle. And to be fair, it doesn't mean it's always preventable. We have been incredibly involved in South Carolina through one of our members and a handful of other brands that are based there. There's a lot of things that happen in politics that have nothing to do with good policy, that have different restrictions that are put in place. And we will continue to work through those things. But ultimately, getting a bill across, even when it's not perfect, can really help us sometimes at the federal level. And it's important to ask those questions when you see bills in states that are introduced and are supported or moved forward. Ask those questions of the groups that are involved, because there's a lot more that goes on, to get a bill across. And it's a lot harder to get legislation passed than it is to kill a bill. But killing a bill has really hurt us in the past, where the perception is hemp doesn't want regulation. We do want regulation, and we will start with making compromises. So we have to make sure that's heard loud and clear. And a lot of that starts at the state level. But until then, you would think, what existential threat? Breakthrough Beverage made an announcement that they are entering the THC hemp beverage space. We have seen continued expansion through various retail channels and partners, continued support through some of our partners that are already active in the space. So if you just looked, and this is why consumers aren't aware these products could go away, it's because they aren't seeing that impact yet. Now, come June, July, where products might be coming off the shelves, or maybe retailers decide to watch their inventory more, or retailers don't renew with certain brands and they focus on some of their top performers, that might change things. But as of right now, it feels like business as usual. And I think a lot of people are kind of reaping the benefits of that. And we've seen a lot of positive milestone indicators. I mean, we had Total Wine and David Trone kind of saying, we expect this to be the next $30 billion industry, putting us right around craft beer. Sales are still climbing. New brands are still launching. Retailers are entering and expanding the space. Like I said, we've also seen a number of brands actually secure additional funding. When that happens, people start asking questions like, do they know something we don't? I hope they know something we don't, because right now we do not, it is not a guarantee that we fix something before November 12th, which is again why there's so much urgency on the funding and donations and getting involved with associations, because there is no guarantee. However, we know there's demand and we know that you can't regulate away demand. So we still continue to focus on growing the industry while creating a safe infrastructure for us to work within. One thing I'm going to continue to highlight, the GLP-1 impact. We are seeing a lot of conversation around this. There's been a lot of studies, whether it's through the Journal of, Journal of American Medicine, or various groups basically saying how GLP-1s are not only impacting adult beverages in terms of alcohol consumption, but they're impacting how lots of other things are consumed, because it kills cravings for different food items. It kind of reduces, actually, a couple of those studies have said it reduces addiction of certain issues. And that can be an addiction to sugar, that can be an addiction to other things. So like when you start looking at data like that, there's going to be a much wider trickle effect or ripple effect, if you will, of how GLP-1s impact consumer consumption behavior as a whole. But what's interesting is that they're just starting to really tie this to alcohol consumption, which led to a study that was discussed very heavily by the Brewers Association last month, where they said THC, whether it's marijuana or hemp, is not the cause for the alcohol decline. They're seeing very little impact there, pretty minimal. And again, this came from the Brewers Association. And when I share this deck, the link to their article will be included in that. And this image that I'm showing right now is talking about the change in consumer behavior over the last 40 years or so. You've heard me reference this probably in the past if you've tuned in before, where I've talked about the Carnegie Mellon University study. And this is kind of a recreation of that, where they talk about the just increase in access to marijuana, and that it has daily consumption has surpassed alcohol's daily consumption. However, it doesn't mean that it's taking away from alcohol. And I think that's really interesting. And what a lot of people talked about in the article was how the occasion dictates the beverage. And we've said this a lot, the experience, and how alcohol, particularly beer, is known as a social beverage. People generally drink that when they're out and they're being social. Like you're at a baseball game. I mean, we just had opening day. Baseball, I mean, who doesn't have a beer at a game? Just saying hypothetically. They're social, but a lot of the use cases for THC beverages are not social. We have functional purpose. A lot of people talk about having these right before they go to bed. A lot of people talk about using these for moments of self-reflection and meditation, or just a wind down on a Tuesday. But when they go out with their friends, I always say when I go out with my girlfriends, I'm sharing a bottle of wine or two. Different lubricants for different events and different activities. And I think that is what's really coming to light. And then these slides or these images also came from the Brewers Association summary that was released at the end of last month. And I don't believe we got to cover it in our last presentation, so I wanted to make sure I featured it here. But this screenshot that says, so what does THC take from beer? And then it said, not much, not significant. That came directly from the Brewers Association article. So, we hear a lot about alcohol and THC beverage whether one is cannibalizing the other or not. And the data is really showing, particularly for beer, that that is not the case. Now, I have heard people on the wine side feel that wine shares and overlaps more experiences with THC beverage or THC products more than other things. And I could see that to a degree because I think there are a lot of people that wind down with a glass of wine on a Tuesday. They might not go after certain types of alcohol at certain times, and maybe there is more overlap there, but it's never been an either or. I still believe that, alcohol is definitely a little bit more social. So depending on who you are spending your time with, what environment you're in, there's equal opportunity for all of the adult beverage categories. And that is what we should be focusing on, supporting each other as the term adult beverage gets redefined. And we talk about this a lot, and I've mentioned it before, even prior to this slide even. We can't regulate away demand. Normalization is happening. The cat is out of the bag. Now, from a regulatory standpoint, it can be put back in the bag, but the demand has been proven and that is being heard. Adult beverage is being redefined. That's, I think, very clear from a lot of the, studies and the things I just shared from the Brewers Association, for example. I do believe lower dose hemp beverage will find a way, whether it's before November 12th is the question, but going into next Congress, how quickly can we get it reopened? That is a very real opportunity. I do believe that there is interest in regulation and interest in creating a safe marketplace. And it's just a matter of us getting more time. And that isn't something, unfortunately, we're guaranteed. But I can tell you there are so many united efforts working collectively to get this over the line. And again, we might have to start somewhere that isn't perfect, but progress over perfection has always been the key to success here. As we kind of wrap up this presentation, talking about Q2 events, now, not a one size fits all, not everyone has to be at every event. And I always want to reiterate that, particularly when funds can be tight. We realize that, with the existential threat of November 12th, that funding can be very difficult to come by right now. As a result, I think it's important that people spend wisely and really look for where they are going to get the ROI they are looking for, whether it's new retailers or wholesalers, or really establishing their foothold in a specific marketplace. For example, just this week, I was at the CSP Cannabis Forum. It was their first event focused on this. It's a convenience store focused event itself, but it was really heavily dominated by the conversation around THC beverage, but hemp-derived products in general and what can be sold at C-stores. The vibes were high, no pun intended. People were still very excited, eager to learn how they could support and get involved in protecting the industry because they still continuously want to see, these products be made available and sold and served in their retail locations. But those events are important for the overall awareness, because it's not just about making sure that customers and grassroots efforts, that there's awareness there. It's making sure that everyone is aware of the real potential consequences that come around with that November 12th deadline. Looking at these events, there's a variety that some of which I listed because CABA is involved specifically. For example, the Pennsylvania Food Merchants Association annual conference, CABA is on a panel with a handful of other industry folk, but I don't necessarily anticipate that that is going to be an event where there's going to be a ton of hemp-derived THC beverages on display. Beverage Forum is in Manhattan Beach. There is a very large, and I wish I had gotten a picture of that panel. There's a panel with, I believe, Cheech from Cheech and Chong, Jake Bullock from Can, I believe Justin Tidwell with Nowadays is also on it, and I believe maybe Greg from Willie's Remedies on there, as well as someone from I believe Total Wine on that panel. It's a great THC beverage panel. So I think it'll be very interesting to see, what the conversation is come end of April at that show. But last year, the vibes were high at that show as well. Really great for retailer relationships. There's a lot of powerful brands and a lot of star power at that show. I think Jason Kelsey will be there if you're a football fan or just a fan of Taylor Swift and therefore now the Kelsey brothers. The National Restaurant Show is coming up mid-May. There might be some brands that are participating on that here. There were a handful last year. Because of the timeline, I think there's a lot of people pulling back from some of these events, just depending on maximizing ROI and making sure that they're spending where they feel they'll get the most bang for their buck. Looking at June, the Cannabis Regulator Association external stakeholder meeting is happening. There's a number of members of CABA participating on a variety of panels, whether it's about hemp versus marijuana in general or hemp beverage specifically. A lot of conversations there. BevNet Live, I think there's a lot of people on this call that probably met for the first time in person at a BevNet Live, but I anticipate that this will be a heavy focus conversation-wise there as well. June 14th through the 16th in Chicago, there is the Ignite It conference, which really covers kind of more cannabis, but always focuses a little bit on the hemp-derived and beverage category for obvious reasons. And then June 17th through the 18th is the Hemp Beverage Expo. This is their second annual event that is in, I want to say Austin, and I apologize for not knowing that off the top of my head. But these are the events that we highlighted for Q2. There's obviously plenty of consumer-facing events that you might be able to, participate in as well during this time. I know there's a ton going on in Miami. Florida is a great market for these consumer-facing events, particularly because they generally have good weather. But there's a lot of other events that I know brands are spending money on. But these are the ones we want to highlight. If you have any additional events that you are either participating in or are going to feature hemp beverage pretty specifically, do not hesitate to message me about those so that I can highlight them on the next meeting. And I realize now, based on the timeline, I probably didn't get to provide an update on my last federal update call on CannaBev Summit, which a lot of people on this call did attend. Just to give a quick summary of that before we wrap it up and get to questions in general. Vibes were high there, but that event is very different from last year. It focused a lot more on regulatory policy. I think Ian Dominguez of Delta Emerald did a really great job of making sure that the participants there who were speaking were coming from more traditional business and retail, as well as the wholesalers and also associations that have a lot of experience lobbying at the federal level. Really educating the THC beverages and the suppliers on the marketplace and how we can all collectively work together on improving the marketplace. And I think that was important. One thing that I do want to call out is I know for the last few months I've been talking about fundraising and strategies, and I'm aware that it hits different when someone from Total Wine or Dawson from WSWA really emphasizes a particular issue. I'm not offended by that. Candidly, I'm glad we're all echoing the same message. And I think that's the most important thing that we need to highlight right now is that we are all working together, highlighting the same message and collaborating. But it's not lost on me that hearing from a leader in convenience or a leading in liquor and retail, hearing from WSWA or the Beverage Wholesalers for Responsible Regulation, I know that that voice hits harder. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that crossover between the events over the next, few months. Definitely something that I felt at the CSB Cannabis Forum. That was a really great opportunity where they were able to highlight a lot of the hemp beverage industry folks and the hemp industry folks in front of the convenience group so that they could get familiar with us and really build bridges and personal relationships between our groups, because that's the key to us having success here is building those bridges. And these events do allow for that in a very big way. And we always include this, particularly with Kentucky maybe getting an on-premise, bill across here. Cannabis beverage certification. This is an opportunity to get training for your teams on how to serve these products alongside alcohol at bars, restaurants, things like that. We want to show that they can coexist and work in the same atmospheres. We will continue to look for research studies and opportunities that might be able to be funded by the government to make sure that they have continued built trust in the category and the industry and how these products can be sold and served. But this is a great proactive certification that you can implement with your teams. I know some of the wholesalers and retailers have done this with their teams so they can make recommendations, whether it's sales recommendations at retail or on premise, highly recommend. On that note, I will jump over to questions now. Let me see here. Q&A. When do these sessions begin to get sponsored by Diet Coke? I don't know. That is a great question, Jason. I'm going to find that out for you and I will continue to hammer that. I feel like I liked Diet Coke before it was trendy and that needs to become a thing. But I'll work on that separately. Let's see. So we did get a question about the Hemp Beverage Alliance and how we work with the coalition. So we are very aligned on our mission. We do work collectively with them on, our alignment at the federal level. We only focus on the advocacy stuff. So when it comes to some of the, I should say the federal landscape. So when it comes to some of the state stuff, we will help promote whatever activity they have at the state level. We do coordinate efforts between our lobbying teams at the federal level. Ultimately, I think there's a lot of collaboration happening amongst all of the groups. I think I might have mentioned that there are calls where all 20 plus hemp beverage lobbyists are working together on the same issues to make sure we have the strategy outlined and we all know what each other are working on. Ultimately, us being aligned and collaborating is critical to our success. So there is a lot of alignment there and a lot of collaboration. Okay, what are some questions in terms of what brands can do towards the balance of the year that can help support the fight, but also with any positioning efforts you think would be fruitful? I think that there are right now, I think what a lot of the brands can do is drive awareness through their consumer base and work with their retailers to make sure that the awareness is heard at the retail level as well. I think that is not only PR worthy, but we need to keep the momentum moving. So I would focus on that a little bit. I think it's also important that everyone from the supply chain, raw material suppliers, all the way through to the retailers are donating in some fashion. I can tell you the BAMCO founders have put a lot of resources, time, and money into their advocacy and lobbying efforts. I can tell you, all of CABA's dues go towards our lobbying efforts and advocacy efforts. We don't have any paid staff, so every dollar that comes into CABA is being utilized to support the advocacy efforts and the education that you see. I think that it is important that everyone realizes that they can play their role. It's tough because I realize that not everyone's financial situations allow for them to give large volumes of dollars. But I think it's important for everyone here that every little bit helps. We did a fundraiser earlier for a congressman where we shared, a URL and a QR code for people to donate. And we very quickly were able to get over the amount we needed. And I think that it just goes to show when there is a direct call to action and people realize that that $50 donation, you get $150 donations. That's not nothing. It's a substantial amount. I do think we have to be a little bit more strategic about where we spend our dollars. I think that there are some efforts, whether it's events or sponsorships or candidly, I think that some of the really big fly-ins, they cost a lot of money. It costs a lot of money for people to come to DC for certain activations. And I think we can be a little bit more, I don't want to use the word restrictive. I just think efficient. We know we have limited dollars and resources. We know we're a small emerging industry. As a result, I don't want to see blowing cash on things where we're not going to have maximum impact. And right now, I think maximum impact for us really comes from those direct conversations we're having with members of Congress, getting legislation passed at the state level that is going to influence whether or not we get a champion at the federal level. It's partially why you see some of the champions signing on for the extension and other things. They're signing on because they're looking at their states and they're seeing, an opportunity, or maybe they have farmers in their market. It's important that we make sure we focus on those key champions that can help us get this over the line. But I don't think that means it's supporting everybody. It's supporting certain individuals that have key positions that can really assist us in getting our initiatives over the line. Let's see. All right, we did get a question about what brands can expect from the distributor side, digital and e-commerce support, and what retailers and on-premise accounts need to see when a distributor enters a new category. Um, I think there's a lot of different pieces there, so I'm going to address a couple things. One thing that I think we should all be aware of is e-commerce is a very difficult thing for the federal government to wrap its head around, and this is a little bit separate from the question that was asked. But I can tell you in conversations at the federal level, when you bring up direct to consumer, they hear direct to children. And that is something that someone actually said back to me. And, we all know that there's plenty of technologies that are in place that can make it very efficient to use e-commerce. I think beverage in general is not focused as much on D2C and e-commerce as other categories, but it doesn't mean it doesn't still exist. I know there's plenty of brands that are probably getting revenue, about 30%, maybe on the high end of their revenue from that. We've always said direct to consumer is really a state level issue, and that's where we've seen it handled primarily. But I do think that the e-commerce support is going to be something that people are probably a little bit more less focused on. Maybe they use that up until the very end, because one thing that we do have to be cognizant of is if we are expecting a ban come November 12th and these products become Schedule 1 drugs come November 13th, wholesalers that have federal licenses do not want these products in their warehouses. So where do they go? How do they I think that's why we're going to see such a cool down period in terms of inventory, because they don't want to have those products necessarily in their licensed facilities. Now, I think there's a lot of different ways people have gotten creative about how they've set up their businesses to kind of protect that, because we obviously have wholesalers that have federal licenses that are in this space now. But I think that is something that we are going to have to be very, very aware of. Retailers, and I think there's a lot of things that we need to level set with when it comes to distributor relationships. And we had this conversation at the CSP event. The brand, while they might bring on a new distributor, and it's great to make that announcement, the brand is going to be heavily dependent on bringing the awareness to retailers and on-premise accounts that their product is available there. We cannot rely just on the distributor to sell in that product and have that product moved, particularly with a newer category. This is very, very relevant to the convenience store channel, where the feedback was, unless it is loud and proud that your product is now available at the C-store or at that convenience store, the product doesn't move, because most consumers, when they're refilling their truck or a car and running into a C-store, they're in that store for like less than a minute. They already know what they're going to grab. I know when I go into those stores, I'm usually grabbing a Diet Coke, maybe a Celsius energy drink. It depends on the day and where I'm driving and how far. But when you have that limited amount of time to influence a purchase decision, if you're not making it very, very clear that your product is aware in that store, it is going to be very difficult to see growth on that category. This is not the same as energy drinks. Everyone is aware energy drinks are available at C-stores and they know what their preferred brand is and they go in and they grab it. We are still very much in the education onboarding side of this category. This category, while yes, we've seen data and reports that say it's about $1 billion industry, this is just barely scratching the surface of what this industry can be. So we know we need to continue doing more education and awareness there. And unfortunately, I have to wrap up this call because I do have another one that starts in about 5 minutes. So I don't have time to go through all of the questions, but we did get some state-specific questions, which candidly, because we are a federally focused group, I do not know all the details on all of the states in terms of what nuances might have happened over the last week or so. But I do think that I can provide those updates hopefully in the weekly newsletter for the CABA members. And I will try to get some additional updates on the states next month in next month's call, which I think will be pretty inclusive of what's happening as we start to wrap session in a couple markets too. So we'll have some finalized details about what's being pushed across or what, governors are signing across their desk, hopefully by the next call here on the third Thursday of next month, which we will try to stick to as long as I don't get sick. But on that note, thank you guys for joining. Really appreciate you guys continuing to tune in. If there are additional questions that you would like me to address in the future, do not hesitate to email me and let me know what else we should be covering in these calls each month. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.